The United States, emerging from World War II as the world's dominant military and economic power with no territorial ambitions in the Eastern Hemisphere, with a foreign policy tradition rooted in avoiding permanent alliances and old-world entanglements, with public opinion shaped by isolationist sentiment and war weariness, somehow transformed over 7 decades into a nation permanently embedded in Middle Eastern conflicts, maintaining dozens of military bases from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, conducting continuous combat operations across multiple countries, spending trillions of dollars on wars and interventions, sacrificing thousands of American lives, and contributing to hundreds of thousands of regional deaths, and creating a situation where American military disengagement from the Middle East seems practically impossible despite recurring promises from politicians of every persuasion to end forever wars and bring troops home. And this transformation from reluctant external power occasionally intervening in Middle Eastern affairs to permanently deployed military force conducting open-ended operations wasn't the result of a single decision or master plan, but rather an accumulation of choices, each seeming reasonable or necessary in its moment, each creating commitments and dependencies that made the next intervention more likely. And the drivers were multiple and reinforcing the economics of oil dependence and petrodollar recycling, the security, commitment to Israel and the domestic political power of pro-Israel lobbying, the arms sales relationships with Gulf monarchies that created financial and strategic interdependencies, the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union that militarized regional conflicts, the post-Cold War conviction that American power could reshape the region according to liberal democratic principles, the 9/11 attacks that created permission for unlimited military action against terrorism, and the institutional interests of a massive military-industrial intelligence complex that requires enemies and missions to justify its existence, and understanding how these factors combined and reinforced each other, how choices made in the 1940s and 1950s created path dependencies that constrained options in the 1970s and 1980s and 2000s, how America's Middle East entanglement became self-perpetuating through mechanisms that generate new crises requiring new interventions. This reveals fundamental truths about how great powers get trapped in permanent conflicts, how short-term thinking creates long-term catastrophes, and how the intersection of economics, domestic politics, and security imperatives can override strategic rationality and create commitments that nobody planned and nobody wants, but that prove impossible to escape. The oil factor was foundational, because American and European industrial economies in the mid-20th century were becoming increasingly dependent on petroleum, not just for transportation, but for petrochemicals and plastics and agriculture and manufacturing, and the Middle East, particularly the Persian Gulf region, contained the world's largest proven oil reserves, concentrated in a relatively small geographic area, controlled by weak states and traditional monarchies that lacked military power or technological sophistication. And this created both opportunity and vulnerability. Opportunity for Western oil companies and governments to access cheap energy that fueled post-war economic growth. Vulnerability because dependence on Middle Eastern oil meant that instability or hostile control of oil-producing regions could cripple Western economies. And the United States initially approached this through corporate mechanisms. American oil companies like Aramco obtained concessions from Saudi Arabia, developed oil fields, and extracted petroleum under profit-sharing arrangements that gave most revenue to American corporations, and similar arrangements existed in Iran with Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, in Iraq with Iraq Petroleum Company, and across the Gulf. And these arrangements were enormously profitable for Western companies, provided cheap energy for industrial economies, and seemed stable as long as regional governments remained friendly, but they created several problems. They generated nationalist resentment because local populations saw their resources extracted by foreigners while they remained poor. They made regional stability a vital Western interest requiring intervention to protect, and they created financial flows that would later be recycled into American debt and arms purchases, establishing economic dependencies that locked America into the region. The 1953 coup in Iran revealed how oil economics would drive military and intelligence intervention, because Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, democratically elected and genuinely popular, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, arguing that Iran's oil should benefit Iranians, not British shareholders, and this was reasonable from an Iranian nationalist perspective. The British had taken most of the profits for decades while Iran remained underdeveloped, but it threatened the entire concession system. If Iran could successfully nationalize and other countries followed, Western oil companies would lose their cheap access to Middle Eastern petroleum. So Britain and America organized a coup. MI6 and CIA working together overthrew Mossadegh, installed the Shah as autocratic ruler, and reversed the nationalization, and this seemed successful in the short term. Secured Western access to Iranian oil, prevented the precedent of successful nationalization from spreading. But it had catastrophic long-term consequences. It associated America with suppressing Iranian democracy and with supporting dictatorship. It created deep Iranian resentment that would fuel the 1979 revolution, and it established the pattern that America would use covert and military action to protect oil access, making intervention the default response to threats to energy security. And this pattern repeated. The U.S. supported authoritarian regimes across the region: Saudi monarchy, Gulf Emirates, eventually Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Anybody who would keep oil flowing and keep prices stable. And this meant American credibility and interests became tied to these regimes' survival, required defending them against internal opposition and external threats, and created moral hazard where these regimes could act recklessly knowing America would protect them. The petrodollar system that emerged in the 1970s deepened the economic entanglement and created financial mechanisms that made disengagement costly, because when oil prices quadrupled during the 1973 oil embargo, triggered by Arab producers punishing America for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the oil-producing states suddenly had enormous financial surpluses, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue that exceeded their ability to spend domestically, and the United States under Nixon. And Kissinger negotiated arrangements, particularly with Saudi Arabia, where these petrodollars would be recycled into U.S. Treasury bonds and American banks. So Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states would price oil in dollars, would invest their surpluses in dollar-denominated assets, would keep their reserves in American financial institutions, and in exchange America would provide security guarantees, military protection, and advanced weapons. And this created a perfect symbiosis from the American perspective. The oil price shock that could have devastated the American economy instead became a mechanism for financing American debt. The dollars that flowed out to pay for oil flowed back to purchase treasury bonds, and this helped America finance its deficits, maintain dollar dominance in international finance, and created financial dependency where Gulf monarchies had huge stakes in American economic stability, so their interests aligned with American interests, and this seemed brilliant. But it meant that American financial stability became dependent on Gulf monarchies continuing to recycle petrodollars. Meant that protecting these monarchies became protecting American financial system. And it created the Carter Doctrine in 1980, explicit declaration that America would use military force to prevent any hostile power from controlling Persian Gulf oil. This wasn't just about energy access anymore, but about protecting the financial architecture that depended on petrodollar recycling. And it meant permanent military presence in the Gulf became official policy, and subsequent administrations expanded this presence, built bases, pre-positioned equipment, conducted exercises, sold weapons, and created such deep military integration that withdrawal became almost unthinkable. The Israel relationship added another dimension that made disengagement impossible, because American commitment to Israel's security, initially limited and ambiguous, became absolute and unconditional over several decades. Driven partly by genuine strategic considerations, Israel was democratic and pro-Western in a region of autocracies and Soviet clients, partly by domestic politics. The Israel lobby became extraordinarily effective at mobilizing American political support and punishing politicians who questioned Israeli policies, and partly by cultural and religious factors. American evangelical Christians developed theological commitments to Israel, and this created a political situation where unconditional support for Israel became mandatory for American politicians. And this had several consequences for American Middle East policy. It meant America had to maintain military superiority in the region to guarantee Israel could defeat any coalition of enemies. This required arms sales and military aid to Israel, but also to Arab states like Egypt and Jordan to buy their peace with Israel and to balance against states like Syria and Iraq that remained hostile. And it meant American policy toward regional conflicts was constrained by Israeli preferences. America couldn't fully embrace Arab nationalism or Palestinian rights because this would conflict with Israeli interests, and it created automatic American involvement in Arab-Israeli conflicts. The 1973 war where America resupplied Israel, the 1982 Lebanon intervention, the multiple rounds of peace process diplomacy, and after the Cold War, when Soviet backing for Arab states disappeared, American-Israeli military cooperation intensified, and America became primary guarantor of Israeli qualitative military edge, providing advanced weapons and intelligence and diplomatic cover. And this made America a party to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, made America responsible in Arab and Muslim eyes for Israeli occupation and settlement expansion, and created enormous resentment that would fuel anti-American terrorism and insurgency. But the domestic political power of pro-Israel lobbying meant that American politicians couldn't distance from Israel without career consequences. So the commitment deepened regardless of strategic costs, and this became another factor making disengagement impossible, because abandoning the region would mean abandoning Israel, and this was politically unthinkable in American politics regardless of what strategic logic might suggest. The arms sales relationships created their own dependencies and locked America into regional security provision, because Gulf monarchies and other friendly regimes wanted advanced American weapons, partly for genuine security against regional threats, partly for prestige and regime legitimacy, and America was happy to sell. This generated profits for defense contractors, created jobs in politically important congressional districts, recycled some of the petrodollars back into American economy, and created military dependencies where these countries needed ongoing American support for training and maintenance and spare parts. So buying American weapons meant buying into American security umbrella, and this served American interests, created client relationships, gave America leverage and influence, ensured these countries remained aligned with American policy, but it also created obligations. If Saudi Arabia bought billions in American weapons and then faced external threat, America couldn't just let those weapons fail or let the Saudis be defeated. This would destroy American credibility as arms supplier and security guarantor, would encourage other clients to seek alternative suppliers, would undermine the entire system of American weapons exports and security relationships. So arms sales created implicit commitments to defend the buyers, and these commitments became explicit over time. The massive arms sales to Saudi Arabia in the 1980s and 1990s came with training, missions and base access, and eventually troop deployments. And when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, threatening Saudi Arabia, America had to respond with overwhelming force, not just because of oil or abstract security interests, but because American credibility as security guarantor was at stake. And the Gulf War established American military presence in Saudi Arabia, troops and aircraft and bases. And this presence, intended as temporary, became permanent, and it became grievance for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, foreign troops on sacred Saudi soil. And this contributed to 9/11. So the arms sales and security relationships that seemed purely commercial and beneficial created commitments and presences that generated blowback. But the relationships were too profitable and too strategically embedded to abandon. Defense contractors depended on Gulf sales, Gulf states depended on American protection, and the cycle perpetuated itself. The Cold War militarized regional conflicts and established interventionist patterns that persisted after Soviet collapse, because the Soviet Union supported Arab nationalist regimes and movements, Egypt under Nasser, Syria, Iraq, the PLO, and various communist parties and insurgencies, and this made Middle East another Cold War battlefield, where American and Soviet competed for influence. And America responded by supporting anti-communist forces, authoritarian monarchies, Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan, anyone who opposed Soviet clients. And this meant regional conflicts became proxy wars, weren't just about local issues, but about global superpower competition. And this justified American military involvement, justified supporting dictators and fundamentalists, justified covert operations and arms supplies, and it created habits and institutions. CIA operations in the region, military relationships, forward deployed forces, and these didn't disappear when Cold War ended. The infrastructure and relationships and interventionist mindset persisted. And instead of withdrawing when Soviet threat disappeared, America expanded its presence, because now there was no countervailing power, no risk of superpower confrontation. And this created the unipolar moment where American power seemed unlimited and where remaking the Middle East according to American preferences seemed achievable. And this led to the most disastrous interventions, because Cold War at least imposed some caution, some fear of escalation. But in the 1990s and 2000s, these constraints were gone, and American foreign policy establishment convinced itself that military power could solve Middle Eastern problems, could spread democracy, could eliminate threats before they materialized, could reshape the region. And this hubris led directly to Iraq War and broader war on terror and the catastrophes that followed. The 9/11 attacks were the critical inflection point that transformed limited American military presence into open-ended permanent warfare, because the attacks created domestic political demand for revenge and security, created permission for unlimited military action against terrorism and states that harbored terrorists, and created bipartisan consensus that America must prevent future attacks regardless of cost. And the Bush administration used this permission to launch not just targeted action against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but a broader project to remake the Middle East. The war on terror became justification for invading Iraq on false pretenses, for expanding military operations into Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan, for building massive new military infrastructure across the region, for drone warfare and special operations and indefinite detention, and for asserting presidential power to use military force anywhere, anytime against anyone designated as terrorist. And this created permanent war, because terrorism is tactic, not enemy. You can't defeat it militarily. You can only kill individual terrorists, and killing terrorists often creates new terrorists. So the war on terror became self-perpetuating, each intervention creating new grievances and new enemies requiring new interventions, and the institutional interests aligned to perpetuate this. The military needed missions and budgets. The intelligence agencies needed threats to justify surveillance and covert action. The defense contractors needed wars to sell weapons and services. The think tanks and foreign policy establishment needed crises to justify their relevance. The politicians needed to appear tough on terrorism, and the media needed dramatic conflict to cover. So everyone with influence had interest in continuing the wars, and the costs were diffused. Deficit financed so taxpayers didn't feel immediate burden. Volunteer military, so no draft to create middle-class opposition, and most casualties were Iraqi and Afghan and Syrian, not American, so domestic political pressure to end the wars was limited, and this meant the wars continued, year after year, administration after administration, despite accomplishing nothing, despite clearly making problems worse, because the incentive structures and institutional interests all pointed toward continuation. The Arab Spring and Syrian civil war demonstrated how deeply embedded America had become and how difficult disengagement was, because when Arab populations rose up against dictators in 2011, America faced impossible choices: support democracy and abandon allied dictators like Mubarak, or support stability and abandon democratic rhetoric. And American chose inconsistently. Supported uprising in Libya and Syria where the dictators weren't clients, opposed or undermined uprising in Bahrain and Egypt where the regimes were allies. And this incoherence reflected the contradictions in American policy. Wanted democracy but needed stability. Wanted to support popular movements but couldn't afford to lose client regimes. And in Syria, the half-hearted intervention, supporting rebels but not enough to win, opposing Assad but not enough to remove him, created catastrophe, prolonged the war, enabled ISIS to emerge, created refugee crisis that destabilized Europe and required ongoing American military presence to manage the chaos. And Obama tried to disengage, declared Assad must go but wouldn't enforce it, withdrew from Iraq but had to return when ISIS emerged, wanted to pivot to Asia but kept getting pulled back to Middle East. And this demonstrated the impossibility of disengagement, because American actions over decades had created situations where withdrawal would create chaos, would abandon allies and commitments, would create power vacuums that adversaries would fill. So, staying seemed less bad than leaving, even though staying wasn't working, and Trump tried to disengage. wanted to withdraw from Syria and Afghanistan, declared endless wars were stupid and costly, but faced resistance from his own military and foreign policy establishment, was told withdrawal would create catastrophe, and mostly backed down. And Biden finally withdrew from Afghanistan, but the chaotic departure and Taliban victory was used to argue against further withdrawals, proved that disengagement had costs, and reinforced the arguments for staying everywhere else. The institutional entrenchment is the deepest factor making disengagement nearly impossible, because 70 years of Middle East involvement created enormous bureaucratic and corporate interests that depend on continued engagement. The Central Command overseeing Middle East operations, employing thousands of personnel, controlling hundreds of billions in assets. The defense contractors selling weapons and services to Gulf states and Israel, generating tens of billions in annual revenue. The intelligence agencies with massive infrastructure for Middle East operations, the think tanks and academic centers studying the region, the lobbying groups mobilizing political support for various interventions and relationships, the retired generals and admirals working for defense contractors or Gulf states, the foreign policy establishment whose careers were built on Middle East expertise. All of these institutions and interests depend on continued American involvement, and they have enormous influence over policy. They testify to Congress, they advise presidents, they shape media coverage, they fund political campaigns, and they consistently argue for continued engagement, more weapons sales, more military presence, more intervention, and they have real power to punish politicians who advocate withdrawal, can mobilize lobbying pressure, can fund primary challengers, can generate negative media coverage. And this means that even when presidents want to disengage, even when public opinion supports withdrawal, the institutional resistance is enormous, and the path of least resistance is always continuation. Because changing course requires confronting these powerful interests while staying the course only requires inertia, and this institutional entrenchment, combined with the path dependencies created by oil economics and Israel commitment and arms relationships and post-9/11 war on terror, creates a situation where American Middle East military engagement has become effectively permanent, not because any single factor makes it necessary, but because the accumulation of commitments and dependencies and interests creates overwhelming pressure to continue, and the costs of continuation, while enormous in absolute terms, are diffused and mostly borne by others, while the costs of withdrawal are concentrated and immediate and would be borne by powerful interests that can defend themselves. The Iraq War exemplified how all these factors combined to create disaster, because the decision to invade was driven by multiple motivations: genuine if mistaken belief that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, neoconservative ideology that democracy could be spread by force, Israeli pressure to eliminate a hostile regime, oil company interest in Iraqi reserves, defense contractor interest in profitable war and reconstruction, political desire to appear strong after September 11th, institutional momentum in military and intelligence agencies that wanted to use their capabilities, and bureaucratic politics where state and defense and CIA competed for influence. And none of these factors alone would have been sufficient, but together they overwhelmed opposition. And the war was catastrophic, cost trillions of dollars, killed thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, destabilized the region, created ISIS, empowered Iran, demonstrated American limitations, and destroyed American credibility. But the institutional interests that drove the war weren't punished. Defense contractors made fortunes, military careers advanced, neoconservatives remained influential, and the foreign policy establishment faced no accountability. So the incentives that led to Iraq disaster remained in place, and similar logic drove intervention in Libya and Syria and Yemen, each promising to be limited and successful, each creating chaos and requiring ongoing involvement, and the pattern continues because the underlying structures haven't changed. The institutions and interests and ideologies that produce failed interventions persist and continue to shape policy. And until these underlying factors change, until there's accountability for failure, until the economic dependencies are broken, until domestic politics changes to punish rather than reward intervention, the Middle East will remain a permanent American battlefield, not because it serves American interests. The evidence is overwhelming that it doesn't. but because the specific interests that benefit from intervention are powerful, while the diffuse public interest in peace and disengagement is weak. And changing this would require confronting oil companies and defense contractors and lobbying groups and foreign governments and military institutions and foreign policy establishment, would require admitting decades of failure and waste, would require abandoning commitments and allies, and would require political courage that American politicians have rarely demonstrated. So the most likely future is continuation, more years and decades of permanent war, more trillions spent, more lives lost, more interventions that fail, but that create justification for next intervention, more proclamations that this time will be different, more promises of withdrawal that won't be kept. Because the Middle East became a permanent American battlefield not through single decision, but through accumulation of choices and commitments and dependencies and interests that now seem impossible to escape. A trap that America built for itself through decades of short-term thinking and special interest influence and ideological hubris and institutional momentum. And escaping the trap would require confronting all of these factors simultaneously, would require comprehensive change in how America relates to the region economically and politically and militarily. And there's no sign this change is coming, no political movement strong enough to overcome the entrenched interests, no crisis dramatic enough to force reconsideration. Just continuation of permanent war that serves narrow interests while betraying broader national interest, proving that great powers can be trapped by their own commitments, that past choices constrain present options, that institutions designed for one purpose persist and serve other purposes, and that the intersection of economics and domestic politics and institutional interests can override strategic rationality and create policies that nobody would design from scratch, but that prove impossible to change, making the American military presence in the Middle East the defining feature of U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century, not because it's wise or successful or even intended, but because the path dependencies and institutional interests and accumulated commitments have made it effectively inescapable, a permanent feature of American power that shapes how America relates to the world and how the world relates to America, with consequences that extend far beyond the Middle East to affect American democracy, American economy, and America's global position, making the question of why the Middle East became a permanent American battlefield not just a historical curiosity, but a fundamental question about how great powers make decisions, how short-term interests override long-term strategy, and how nations can become trapped by their own power.